All right, so I'm going to start out by reading the first paragraph in this chapter. 3 generations. We will now look at the role of grandparents in raising of the children. In all Native population, grandparents are part of the family group. They live with and support the entire family in their day-to-day activities. They provide counsel and mediation with the parents and their children. They are the glue that holds the family together, and their wisdom is respected by all.
Right. So we got some work to do here in the United States. I mean, we came here without the grandparents and then, broke the whole thing up coming here. So it's kind of like appreciating what was going on back then and what could happen here now for most of us. I mean, some of us obviously in the United States have been here for many generations, so there are grandparents here.
Yes.
But even for them, they experienced this breakup of the family when they came over here. Mm-hmm. So we need to kind of talk about what this family unit, including the grandparents, is really, how it's designed to work. Because life is designed to work. Mm-hmm. So how is this designed to work? This important part of it. And if I look at myself as a child and my parents and then my own grandparents, there's support there for me that's available with the grandparents present that's not present with just my parents. Mm-hmm. Father-son relationships and mother-daughter relationships are the primary relationships. So essentially, they have to be strong and productive, for things to work for the family. If the fathers and sons are at odds with each other, or the mothers and daughters are at odds with each other, the family tends to break down. Mm-hmm. So we have to strengthen those basic primary relationships as much as possible. And that's where the grandparents come in. So my grandfather is really who I am. My father is the middleman between me and him. Energy-wise, my grandfather and me are the same. It's that generationally balanced line of males that I'm part of. I'm his replacement. So you could say it's like a spiritual connection. It's beyond just physical stuff. This is more like my heart is set up a certain way to contribute in life. And it's really where my grandfather was, mm-hmm. that I am, in terms of what I have to contribute. And my father definitely is the person that makes that possible, for me to replace my grandfather. Without this relationship with my father having a son, I wouldn't be able to do that. Mm-hmm. And the same is true for the women. The granddaughter and the grandmother are the same energy. Mm-hmm. And the mother is there to make sure that the grandmother's replacement has been created, So that's what's going on through the generations, recreating ourselves like that. Mm-hmm. And for me to understand myself, I have to certainly understand my grandfather in terms of the way he is, who he is and what he stands for. And by understanding my grandfather on my mother's side would allow me to understand my mother's worldview and my own worldview much better, understanding where he was at, when he conceived my mother. Mm-hmm. So I would get support from the paternal grandfather and the maternal grandfather in understanding myself, mm-hmm. which would allow me to be okay with myself in a way that I couldn't otherwise. Mm-hmm. If my grandfather on my father's side is not present, I just have this father of mine, which is opposite energy to me, to try to figure out who I am, and it's really not the same. I really don't have a clear understanding of who I am until that grandfather is in my life, And my worldview is my mother's worldview, but also it was her father's worldview. So having him explain that to me, and of course he would have explained it to my mother, would allow me much better to understand my mental state, in terms of where I'm coming from and the kind of world that I'm creating, through my mind. So I would have a great opportunity for support with those grandparents present I wouldn't have otherwise. Mm-hmm. Also, both grandmothers, in my situation, for instance, in a balanced mating situation, both grandmothers would be opposite energy to me. They'd be opposite energy to their husbands, mm-hmm. and they would be opposite energy to me. Mm-hmm. So having a grandmother to interact with, is much different than my mother. Mm-hmm. And having that grandmother present would allow me to, and I'm expanding. So if I had a grandmother present, she would be in a balanced mating situation, she'd be contracting opposite energy to me, which would give me someone that I could really do something with, get involved with and work on things together in a balanced way. So I'd have this tremendous opportunity with my grandmothers and my grandfathers to be able to grow and develop in a very positive way. And we've seen this with children that had their grandparents present, that they have much more confidence in themselves, they feel better about themselves, they're much easier to deal with, they're just more open, they're more open. And this also would affect the ability for us to have balanced families. So, if I'm supported well growing up and I feel good about myself, I'm much more likely to have a son than if I was growing up in a situation where I did not feel good about myself, or if I had things that were bothering me. I'd probably have more daughters that way. As far as your support by the grandparents, obviously your mother's mother is someone that you can relate to.
Yes.
And we could talk about that in a minute. But I also wanted to say that, that's on the maternal side, your side. But on your father's side, his mother is also someone that is in you in a sense, because the worldview of your father is in you, and the worldview of your father came from her at conception. So there's a lot of support for you to understand how your life is set up worldview-wise from your paternal grandmother, and also from, in a spiritual sense, from your maternal grandmother. So that's there. And also with the grandfathers, they're opposite energy to you as well, which would allow you to have some this kind of space to operate in that would be very encouraging for you to grow and develop, to have the grandfathers available to you, because the grandfathers are expanding in that situation. You're contracting, your grandmothers are contracting, and their spouses would be expanding, so they would give you this kind of freedom to be that would be available to you that your father couldn't provide. Right. So it's kind of like looking at it from the perspective of a child that's a male and a child that's a female, looking through the generations and seeing the support that the grandparents can be. It's pretty important to try to take a look at that. Right.
I wish I had more of it, but I knew my mother's mother, and we did spend some time with her, and we enjoyed spending time with her, and I knew my father's father, but I didn't know my father's mother, and I didn't really know my mother's father.
Yeah.
So, my grandmother and I have a lot of similar interests, the kind of things she was interested in, and I'm interested in those things. And I do remember one time when I was very young, we were living with my father's parents, and I was upset about something having to do with the sandbox or something, and my father was yelling at me. I was probably like 3 or 4 years old, and I started to cry. And my grandfather came up and he picked me up and he says, "Oh, that's okay." And he took me away, and he was like, "Would you like a big lollipop?" I remember he gave me a really big lollipop. It was, but it was like breaking that, my father was yelling at me. I wasn't doing something.
Yeah, this contracting father.
Yeah.
Then you had this expanding grandfather. And,
But of course, that was one incident, and I was very small, but I can't even imagine what it would have been like to have the support of my grandparents, as an adult. Although I do remember I went to my grandmother when I was getting ready to marry you. And
your mother's mother, right?
My mother's mother. And I said to her, I told her, I said, I'm going to marry Robert. And, my parents were not really supportive of it. And my grandmother told me straight on, she said, they don't live your life. You live your life. And you need to, do what you feel is right for you. Mm-hmm. So that was important to me at the time.
You talked about like how you could dance like your grandmother and stuff like that. And you like the same sort of clothes.
Yeah. One time I was doing some crazy dance that we had learned as teenagers, and I was showing my sisters and my mom. And I was twirling my head around, and my mother made a comment like, I don't know where you come from. I don't know where you get these crazy things. And my grandmother had told me, well, I used to take off my shoes and dance through the streets of New York. She had a lighthearted approach,
Right.
So.
Yeah. And then, of course, the parents, their relationship with each other can be supported by their parents by making them understand if there is a conflict that they have certain worldviews in play here that they have to be responsible for.
Right.
And the whole idea of having some mediation between them and the kids is really, really important because parents and kids can, like you said, they can get into it. I mean, me and my father, if I only had my grandfather to talk to my father about, look, give the kid a break, he's coming from here, you know what I mean? He's trying to do, because he can identify with that. But my father certainly couldn't, My father could never understand me.
Right.
If my grandfather was around, he would have told my father, in a certain way that I could never talk to my father about, and that respect that's there with that older generation makes the difference to having your kids be understood and having the parent-child relationship work.
Right.
So,
I mean, I've talked to many people who have had their grandparents in their life. I mean, like just take cooking, for instance. Oftentimes, people that really love food, they were taught by their grandparents about the food, and they've become good cooks or bakers or whatever.
right.
Uh,
The parents are going to work most of the time. So who's going to take care of the kids, Well, we institutionalize that. Send them to daycare, send them to something, There's nothing like having them grandparents around, you know what I mean, to actually work with the kids.
Right.
And, that's a whole different situation than having them in some institution. I know I was put into that situation where, my mother wasn't around or something, and other people were taking care of me. And I remember how bad I felt, being isolated like that, where no one cared. I mean, the people she was hiring to take care of us, or the places they put us to take care of us, I mean, those people were just, it's just, they had no connection. I had no connection to those people. And I was a lonely person because of that. I didn't feel good about myself. But my grandparents were there, been a whole different situation. So,
well, and I know that in the past, the people that we have interviewed that seem to be very relaxed about who they are, and oftentimes like we'll talk to them, and they knew their grandparents were involved in their upbringing, and they seem to be more at ease with who they are when they've had that experience.
And it's also, they're more likely to be able to reproduce themselves in terms of a balanced sort of situation. If I feel good about myself, I could have a son. If I don't feel good about myself, I'm less likely to have one.
Right.
The same is true for a woman. She's more likely to have a daughter if she feels good about herself.
Right.
So you can see when the three generations are working together, the kids would feel better about themselves. And that would allow, for their families to be more likely to be balanced.
Right.
Where the situation is where somebody doesn't feel good about themselves creates, like on the male side, all these daughters, and on the female side, all these boys, which is imbalanced, and that tends to create the next generation imbalanced as well. It's an imbalance in the family that's created out of this two-generational thing that keeps getting worse, actually, to the point where we don't even reproduce anymore. So many people are just not doing it. They see it to be an inconvenience. It's really the final straw, when you don't reproduce anymore. And we're seeing that in all the developed countries. Pretty much the birth rate is declining to the point where they're not able to reproduce themselves.
Right.
The more connected you are, the more supported you are to be all that you can be, the more likely you are to reproduce. So three-generational families kind of foster that.
Right.
When the two generations are in survival, the parents are trying to survive and the kids are trying to make it, and everybody goes into survival, we generally do not reproduce very well. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about the future of human being on the planet.
In your family, you're the only one that reproduced.
That's right.
Out of three, then you have one.
I have one child. Mm-hmm. So it's not a very good situation.
And in my family, it's the same. I mean, my oldest sister has 3 children, but the second one has 1, and then, I have none, and Susie has none.
Yeah, you can see that going on. Also, the idea of having to start from scratch every generation starts to disappear when there's generations working together. Mm-hmm. Like, on the male side of my family, it's business people. and we contribute by giving value to people. And even though I wasn't in my father, even though I broke away from my father in terms of starting a business, I was still in that line of business people, doing what I was doing. So essentially, I'm the third generation in business in this country, for sure, on my father's side. My son is the fourth, and my grandsons are the fifth. So we have 5 generations there involved in the same sort of thing. But it wasn't a continuous line of business. In other words, it wasn't like the founding thing my grandfather did, and then we just kept it going. We kind of splintered it up a little bit. My father doing a little different than my grandfather, and then me breaking away from what my father was doing. But again, it was because my father and I couldn't work together. It wasn't like we didn't have the desire to work together, but I didn't have the ability to work with my father because there was no one there to support it. There was no one there really to support it. My mother did what she could do, but my father and mother were fighting with each other. So there wasn't that kind of like support for the next generation to be part of what was going on with that generation. So I broke away.
Right.
Now in my situation with my own son, I understood these distinctions, after my son was born. So I've had the opportunity to work with him with a different type of understanding than I had with my own father. So this is an example of like how, my father and me didn't have that, but I did have it now with my own son so that I could work with him, understanding the difference between us. But my father and him had a connection. And that story about like when he was almost 4 years old, my father, it was the last time we saw my father, he told him that you need to take care of me. So he actually told my son to take care of me, like passing the torch to him to take care of me. And that was, a very special moment for me, especially looking back at it now. My father was basically saying, you're the replacement of me, and to my son. And my son's been involved with me ever since he was a young kid. He was at the market and crawling around on my desk and making comments at the meetings that we all said, how did he come up with that? So he's been involved, the whole time after my father died. And after my father died, I began to recognize these things. And then, of course, it supported, like I said, my relationship with my son. So it's different than it was with my father. Also, I wanted to say that, families need to have something bigger than themselves to unite their efforts, in terms of what they have to contribute. So it's having a mission statement for a family. It sounds absurd. People don't really think like that. They do the best they can to give their kids a good start and have them go along and do what they do, basically restarting again a life, But what we're talking about here is it's possible to have a family unit that actually has a common goal, through the generations, to contribute something of real value, that they, as a unit, So I think that's possible. Like the stand of the market kind of unites everybody, to have a life that works for scarcity and suffering. And each family unit could basically have that same place to come from and contribute in a certain way, what they have to contribute. And people would say, what, do you have to start your own business to do that? And I said, no, organizations could be set up for that. Right now our kids are on their own. But the idea would be that, okay, well, I'm part of some organization that I feel really good about that supports my family's worldview in terms of like what we're really about, as a family unit, and you can be part of that too. So the organizational life could include the generations to come in their development of their organizational structure, where they encourage the generations that are coming to be part of that organization and what they contribute. So it's not impossible to think in terms like that, like to have a family unit that's really about this, and they're part of an organization that's really about that, and together they make the difference to life, in more and more interesting ways. But also it could be that by doing this, you can start something that continues on generation after generation too. If you have a spouse, for instance, and you have a commitment to something and you really want to make that happen like we've done at the market, that can be passed down. So I had to start kind of from scratch here in Atlanta, and it's very difficult. You don't know who to trust. You don't have any support locally. I went through all that. I've been doing it now for 43 years, going on my 44th year. So I know what it feels like to have to do that. But my son has not had to do that. He's had this foundation that's been built using these distinctions for him so that he can pursue some of his ambitions and dreams. And it's very interesting to look at that, because my father's way of doing business, which was really a wholesale business and a transportation business, moving stuff from this country to other countries, is the same sort of thing my son is doing in terms of moving product from other countries here and also being in a transportation business to make that happen. So my son is really the recreation of my father, even in the business side of it in terms of what they're most interested in. And my grandsons may have the spark for the retail side of it, which is what I've been
What you're hoping.
doing. Yeah, which is probably true. So I we can continue this on in more interesting ways. But my grandsons obviously are not going to have to start from scratch. My son didn't have to do that. We can build on what's been done here because we have a solid foundation under it.
Right.
And our understandings of ourselves. And we'd like to see that happen for everyone else as well. All right.